our strength and song. Highest praise to Him belongs. Christ the Lord, our conquering
We have to break
King.
out the
Name
books.
we
I'll get my
raise, your
checkbook
triumph
out of my car.
sing. Oh, praise the Lord, our mighty warrior. Praise the Lord, the glorious one. By His hand we stand in victory. By His name we've overcome. Though the storms of hell pursue, darkest night, we worship You. 'Cause You divide raging seas, death to life, You safely lead. Oh, praise the Lord, our mighty warrior. Praise the Lord, the glorious one. By His hand we stand in victory. By His name we've all the saints and angels bow, hosts of heaven crying out, glory, glory to the King. You reign for all eternity. Oh, praise the Lord, our mighty warrior. Praise the Lord, the glorious one. By His hand we stand in how a Savior came from glory, how he gave his life on Calvary to save a wretch like me. I heard about his groaning, of his precious blood's atoning. Then I repented of my sins and won the victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me ere I knew him, and all my love is to him. He plunged me to victory beneath the cleansing flood. I heard about his healing. I heard about his healing, of his cleansing power revealing, how he made the lame to walk again and caused the blind to see. And then I cried, dear Jesus, come and heal my broken spirit. And somehow Jesus came and brought to me the victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me ere I knew him, and all my love is to him. He plunged me to victory beneath the cleansing flood. Here we go. how a Savior came from glory, how he gave his life on Calvary to save a wretch like me. I heard about his groaning, of his precious blood's atoning. Then I repent.
Okay, y'all. Let's all stand up, not get too comfortable. Not let our lunch settle in just yet. Turn to number 2 in your hymn book. Most of y'all may know it by heart anyway. All right. And Adam's going to lead us.
Well, we're competing with the Bulldogs this afternoon. And so trying to find a topic that would actually be more important than how badly Georgia's going to beat Missouri, I came up with the resurrection of Christ, which I think actually does qualify. We started this morning with the general trustworthiness of Scripture, reasons why we should trust the biblical authors as being dependable in giving us the truth about things. And this afternoon, we're going to move to the central, most important thing of all, and that is the resurrection of Christ. Now, I believe that the Bible is the inspired and inerrant Word of God. But for the sake of argument, for the next hour, I'm simply going to treat it as a historical document. So, a historical document, and the historical case we can make for it is that it's a pretty accurate historical document. You can't establish the inspiration of Scripture on this basis. But it's important that we see the historical case, because if it's not there, then our belief in what goes beyond historical accuracy, and that is inerrancy and inspiration, would have no credibility at all. If the text, if the narrative is full of holes historically, then there's nothing we can do with it religiously, other than confess that we simply are people who blindly believe what we want to believe and know what's true. So we're going to treat the New Testament documents simply as historical documents, and we're going to ask to see what are the criteria by which we determine if a historical document is a good document. I'm not talking about a history book. I'm talking about the materials that the history books are made from. So what a historian has to do is he has to go back and find sources. If we want to understand what happened surrounding the death of Jesus in the first century, we've got to go back and find sources, people who were there who can tell us these things. And so we go back and we look at those documents and we find witnesses to what happened. Now, the historian doesn't just believe everything he reads from those sources. He wants to know, are these reliable witnesses or not? And so it's very interesting that both history and law independently have come up with a set of criteria for examining eyewitness testimony. Historians have to do it with witnesses to events that happened in the past. Lawyers have to know when they're dealing with people giving testimony in court about something that happened in the recent past. How do we know that we can trust these witnesses? And so they both together come up with a set of criteria that have just been proved over time to work. Criteria for identifying reliable witnesses as opposed to witnesses, whether it's to a recent crime or a historical event farther in the past, that we have a good case for trusting their testimony and believing basically what they tell us. So, first and most obvious is proximity to the event. Let's say we hear a horrible crash, rending of metal and screeching of tires out on the street. We all run out of the sanctuary to see what has happened, and we notice that two cars have collided on the street out in front of the church. Are we witnesses to this event? No. We got there too late. We didn't actually see the crash take place. And so if there's a trial to determine which driver is at fault, our testimony is useless, because by the time we got there, it was actually over. You need people who actually saw the thing happen. So if you're looking at the witnesses to the resurrection of Christ, you ask, are these people who could have actually been eyewitnesses? Now, we talked about a skeptical mindset, people who just doubt because they like to doubt, not because they necessarily have a reason for it. I think Brian calls them professional doubters, skeptics. We talked about that mindset and how it responds to the New Testament. One of the ways it responds to it is to try to date the documents really late. And we showed some reasons for believing that those dates just don't work. The Gospel of Luke can't be later than about 60 AD, which is only 30 years after the event. And if Luke used Matthew and Mark as sources, they have to be even earlier than that. The Gospels aren't actually the earliest testimony we have. The Apostle Paul was an eyewitness to the resurrection because Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus, and he saw the resurrected Christ. So he counts as an eyewitness, and the book of Galatians, which may be the first book written in the New Testament, is about AD 50. So the first written documents are only about 20 years down the road from the actual event. In other words, these documents are by people who live within one generation of the event, and they're by people who can make a reasonable claim to have actually been there and be eyewitnesses. Now, Luke, of course, was not an eyewitness, doesn't claim to be, but he's based his account on the people who were. It is very probable that in his journeys with the Apostle Paul, especially when they went through Jerusalem, that Luke contacted and interviewed all the people who could find who were actual eyewitnesses. This is why Luke has so much information about Mary. There's more information about Mary and her family, Elizabeth, in Luke than any of the other Gospels. Why? Because probably passing through Ephesus, where she was living with John, Luke actually interviewed her, got her story, and incorporates it. So when you say Luke wasn't an eyewitness, you're not subtracting an eyewitness from the four. You're actually adding several more that he gives us. And he wrote at a time when he could have done that. Now, you have to understand that when you're dealing with history, you can't have an absolute proof. Okay? We can't put the resurrection in a test tube, and if we add the right ingredients, make it happen again. That's the way science works. You have repeatable experiments. Everybody who does the experiment should get the same result. And if that doesn't happen, you got a problem. If it does happen, you figured something out scientifically. History, you can't do that. We can't go back there. What we have to do is deal with probabilities and with credibility. And these guys were in a time when they could have been eyewitnesses, and they show you a lot of reasons for believing that they actually were. We don't have time to go into all of that. But by the first criterion that we're looking at, is it an actual witness or is this secondhand? The Gospels seem to pass the test. The second thing we're looking for is multiple attestation. And this is a biblical principle. The Old Testament says that at the mouth of two witnesses shall every truth be confirmed. And in fact, you were required to have two witnesses that agreed in any capital court case in the Old Testament. You can't carry out capital punishment unless you got at least two witnesses who have to agree. So multiple attestation. You've got Matthew, one of the 12. Mark is John Mark. Most people think he was the guy who ran away naked when the guys grabbed his tunic and pulled it off. He wasn't naked. He still had what counted as his underwear back then on. But he was a younger person who was part of Jesus' band of associates. He wasn't one of the 12. Maybe he was one of the 70 or the 500. Luke, not an eyewitness, but representing the testimony of many, because he was the one who actually, instead of just writing his own memoirs, did research. Mark represents not only Mark's own testimony, but Mark, in part of his career, served as Peter's associate pastor in the Church of Rome. And it's Peter's notes that form the basis of Mark's gospel. John, the beloved disciple, Jesus' most intimate friend and associate during his period on earth. But it's not just the four Gospels. You also have the Apostle Paul giving his own independent testimony to, yes, Jesus rose from the dead because I saw him on the road to Damascus. You have James, who is not the brother of John, but the half-brother of Jesus. You have Jude, another half-brother of Jesus. So there is a nice handful of witnesses basically giving the same story that, yes, Jesus died, and after that he was alive. And Paul refers to 500 people. There were a total of 500 people that Jesus appeared to at one point or another during that period when he was appearing to his disciples after the resurrection. And Paul says most of them are still alive. So you're talking 30 years later. Most of those 500 are still alive, although some have died by this time. So we've got plenty of witnesses. In fact, a lot of historical events from the ancient world depend on one or maybe two. You know, it's all that survived. That's what we've got. And so the gospel is actually rich in terms of being able to offer us multiple attestations so that you've got the story confirmed by more than one person who's telling you the same story, basically. Now, maybe the most important of these criteria is the consistency of their testimony, okay? It doesn't do you any good to have two witnesses if they don't agree with each other, right? So in order to back each other up, the testimony has to be consistent, but it has to be the right kind of consistency. So this morning we talked about discrepancies and how discrepancies are naturally produced when honest, truly independent witnesses describe the same event. So that's what you're looking for, is you want there to be discrepancies but not contradictions, okay? So if one witness says there were two angels at the tomb, another one says there was an angel, if that's a contradiction, it's a problem. So if it's two angels versus only one angel, now at least one of these guys has to be either mistaken or lying, and the credibility of his testimony and of the total body of testimony goes down. It doesn't necessarily mean just because they disagree that the thing didn't happen, but your confidence in this testimony is going down when you find actual contradictions. You don't want contradictions, but neither do you want absolute, total, word-for-word agreement. Because as we said earlier, when you get that, you suspect collusion. You suspect these people got together and fixed their story. And if they did that, they had some agenda for doing that. And that agenda is not just telling the truth, because otherwise they just show up and tell the truth. And they wouldn't be worried about what the other guy had to say. So they got some kind of agenda either for or against the defendant that's causing them to do this, and their testimony is shot. So if you do that, if you get two witnesses and their testimony is word for word the same, at best, that's not two witnesses, it's only one. One of them's the witness, the other one's copying the first one. At worst, they're lying because they got an agenda other than just telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So you got to have the right kind of testimony. You want there to be discrepancies but not contradictions. Exactly what the Gospels give us. Discrepancies, as we saw earlier, but not discrepancies that actually turn out to be actual contradictions that you can't get past. Now, if you got people who have a credible claim to be actual eyewitnesses, if you got two or more of them and they basically agree and they got the right kind of consistency, you got a pretty solid case. You're basically saying, yeah, this is probably actual, real testimony about the event that I can depend on. There are a couple of more things that if you find those, your confidence goes up even more. And the first is testimony from hostile witnesses. Okay? So, if Brian is accused of a crime again, and I give him an alibi, and you realize, we're good friends. I'm staying at his house. He was my student, how many years ago? Do we even want to know how many years ago that was? And after all this time, we still like each other. And it's like, okay, so I give him an alibi, and that's cool. But, maybe I have a motive for doing that. Maybe I'm bending the truth a little bit in his favor because I want him to get off. But if his worst enemy, obviously not somebody in this room, but Brian's worst enemy who hates his guts, despises him, and has been known to engage in plots against his life in earlier times, if that guy gives him an alibi, that gets your attention. Because what possible motive could he have other than he's under oath and he's got to tell the truth? He has no motive for bending the truth in Brian's favor. Every motive he has is the other direction. And so, boy, his alibi is pretty strong because you're thinking, yeah, this guy's got to be telling the truth because all of his motives to bend the story are going in the other direction. So hostile witnesses are really strong testimony. Now, with the Gospels, one of the arguments you'll get from atheists, especially internet atheists, who are, I suppose, the worst kind, is, well, nobody tells you about the resurrection except believers. This is all coming from Christians. And I'm thinking, well, who else would be telling us? I mean, you're either convinced that Jesus was the Messiah because God raised him from the dead, and therefore you're his disciple and you're spreading the story, or you're not, and you're trying to hush it up. You don't want to be talking about it. You don't have any motive. Who else do we expect to be telling us about this except people who thought that it had happened? But it's more than that. Some of these witnesses aren't currently hostile at the time they give their testimony, but some of them, excuse me, some of them used to be. The Apostle Paul was the most zealous persecutor of the church. He was on a personal mission to wipe it from the face of the earth. He got authorization from the high priest to arrest Christians, drag them back to Jerusalem, put them in jail. It's like he hated Jesus. And then all of a sudden, he flips 180 degrees and becomes Jesus' most zealous apostle. Why would he do that? I mean, that's one of the questions that you have to answer. This is not a good career move for Paul. I mean, he was on a fast track to the top of the Jewish establishment. Young guy, at the first, I mean, he's got a pretty low-key role. We first see him holding the coats for the guys who were martyring Stephen, throwing the stones. But now he's in with the high priest. He's got fast track to the top of the hierarchy. And all he's got to do is keep persecuting the church. And the people in the Sanhedrin who are running things he's their golden boy. Instead, he's going to flip to become one of the people that they're trying to kill and trying to put in jail. I mean, atheists are saying, well, you know, the disciples were motivated because they got to be the leaders of this movement. But have you looked at what the movement was like in those early days? Small, marginalized, hated, despised. You know, you got a hostile witness who was convinced to change his mind. Why? That's a question you want to ask. James, the author of the book of James, isn't the brother of John, son of Zebedee, but James, the half-brother of Jesus, who did not accept Jesus as the Messiah during Jesus' earthly ministry. He was a non-believer in Jesus as the Messiah. Something convinced him that the resurrection was true, that he had been wrong, and he becomes a leader of the Jerusalem church. He's like the chairman of the thing. When they have the Jerusalem council, he's the guy running the meeting. He goes from hostile to friendly. Another flip, not quite as dramatic as Paul's, but there it is. Something got these guys to change their mind. And if you're looking for motives, all the motives are on the other side. They had very little to gain from a purely human secular standpoint, very little, if anything, to gain and a lot to lose by making this flip that they made. So, in a way, we do have hostile testimony. We don't have testimony you can reject because it's all friendly. We have people who started out hostile and flipped. And we have to, one of the things we have to explain as historians is, why would they do that? Other than the fact that, you know, I think getting knocked off your horse by a light that shines brighter than the sun, and a voice saying, Paul, why are you persecuting me, might get your attention. You could think that might happen, yeah. Okay. Criteria number 5. Embarrassing testimony is considered to be really good testimony because historians and lawyers both have to take human nature into account when they're evaluating the evidence. So, human nature is such that if you're going to put a spin on the story, you will do it in such a way that it makes you look good, right? If you're going to change the story, you're not going to change it to your own disadvantage. Insofar as the story relates to you, you want to come out looking better, right? All right, and so if in order to give the defendant an alibi, I have to admit that I was in a very embarrassing situation. It was like, yeah, I know that Brian was home that night, couldn't have committed the crime on the other side of the county because he was at home. I know that because I was breaking into his house. And he caught me. Okay? Now, am I going to make that up? No. I mean, embarrassing testimony. Testimony that is embarrassing to the witness is considered very, very strong evidence. Well, how do the apostles come across in this story? Clueless cowards. 2 words, clueless cowards. If you're making up a story, do you put yourself in it as an idiot? I suppose you could, but that's not normal human motivation, okay? So the apostles come across as clueless cowards. There's another element that is kind of interesting, and that is, who are the first witnesses whose testimony is the foundation and beginning of everything? Women, the Marys, etc. Now, that's not a problem for you and me, I hope. I mean, I don't trust women very well, but I trust them about as well as I do men. I don't see any particular difference there. But in first century Jewish society, women were not considered culturally to be reliable witnesses. In fact, they were not even eligible to give testimony in court. Now think about that for a minute. If you're making this story up, do you make it up so that your most important witnesses are people that your society considers unreliable and untrustworthy as witnesses? I don't think so. So this is a story that the only possible reason for putting those women in that position in this story is that's the way it happened. And you're just telling the truth. There's no motive for changing the story in that direction. There's every motive, if you're changing it, to go in a different direction. And so, the strongest possible testimony is from someone who was there, who is backed up by other people who basically agree, where their agreement has the right kind of consistency, discrepancies but not contradictions. And some of them are hostile witnesses, and they're giving a testimony that is embarrassing to the witness. Man, you're awfully lucky if you get all 5 of those at the same time. You know, you get 3 out of the 5, you're thinking you got pretty good testimony, you can probably convict this guy or exonerate him, as the case may be. But when you're looking at the 4 Gospels and the other witnesses from the New Testament, you can click on all 5. You tick off all 5 boxes. Credible eyewitnesses, multiple attestation, the right kind of consistency, including hostile witnesses and embarrassing testimony. Testimony evaluated as testimony by the criteria that both historians and lawyers have independently developed in dealing with the kind of witnesses they have to draw on to reach their conclusions. And the Gospels pass every single test with flying colors. Therefore, we conclude that we're dealing with basically reliable historical testimony. I mean, doesn't absolutely follow we have to believe everything they tell us, but we have to take them seriously, and we have to accept the facts that they present us as facts that now need to be explained. So, because of this, virtually every credible historian in the world, now I'm talking about people who have PhDs in relevant historical fields from accredited universities, not talking about the kind of cranks who get interviewed on the History Channel. Okay? I mean, if you look at the Jesus mythers, the people who don't think Jesus even existed, you will not find real historians in that group. And I only say virtually because if I said 100%, somebody would find one who is an exception and refute me. And so I'm just kind of hedging my bets here by saying they virtually all accept the following facts as facts. And their job as historians is to try to explain these facts. Number one, we're going to skip Jesus lived because the Jesus mythers have no credibility whatsoever. Jesus lived. He was crucified by Pontius Pilate about 30 AD. He was buried in a borrowed tomb. We know the name of the guy who owned that tomb, Joseph of Arimathea. On the 3rd day, the tomb was empty. And almost immediately, his followers were proclaiming that he had risen from the dead. 4 facts, or if you count that Jesus lived, you can say 5, that virtually every credible historian on the planet agrees are facts. These are not in dispute. Jesus was crucified, he was buried, the tomb was found empty the 3rd day, and his followers were proclaiming practically immediately that he had risen from the dead. Now, I'm not saying all those guys, or even most of those guys, believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Most of them are people with a very secular mindset who reject the resurrection because they think miracles are impossible. They're not even putting a miracle on the table to be considered. But this puts them in a very difficult position because they now have to explain. Their job is, okay, these are the facts. How do we explain this? And they've come up with a number of explanations. Now, we have a handout. Did we? We forgot to distribute that, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
But we're going to do it now at this very dramatic moment where it will have the maximum.
We planned it this way.
Where it will have the maximum impact. Right. That's my story. And if you believe it, you didn't hear anything I said about reliable witnesses. Okay. So, yeah. If we've got the facts, how do we explain this when a lot of us don't want the resurrection to be the explanation? Okay. I'm going to basically go through all the possibilities, trying to cover all the logical possibilities of what could have happened. These are all theories that have been proposed. Now, some of them don't have much credibility, and some of them have been more popular than others. But the first one, surely, is that God raised Jesus from the dead. That's the explanation that the people who were there gave, because they claimed that they had seen him. He didn't appear to everybody, but to selected people who were his followers and people of faith. Well, you can stretch that to include Thomas, who became a person of faith. God raised Jesus from the dead. Now, each one of these theories has a problem. Some of them leave out some of the facts. Some of them deny some of the facts. And you're cheating if you do that as a historian. You can't sweep facts under the table and present your version of the event. You can't deny facts where there's no reason to deny them except that they don't fit your narrative. And you're not doing a good job as a historian if you do that. The only problem with the theory that the explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead is you have to believe a miracle happened. And once again, we're in a position where we simply have to ask people to at least try the experiment of looking at this with an open mind. And we could spend, like again, if we ever had another conference like this, we could spend a whole session talking about miracles. And a lot of those things are in the book, The Young Christian Survival Guide. There's a chapter on just about all of them if you want to follow them up. So the main problem here, and for some people it's a deal breaker, got to believe that a miracle happened. If you can get your mind to be open to the possibility that that could have happened, this turns out to be not only the best explanation, but the only explanation that actually explains it. Okay? Joseph of Arimathea moved the body to a more appropriate resting place. It was never intended to be the permanent grave of Jesus. It was an emergency measure because they had to do something with the body because the Sabbath was about to start. And so Joseph said, okay, fine, we'll put him in my tomb. But then Joseph, as he had planned to do all along, moved the body to a permanent location that he had provided for because he wasn't going to leave it in his family tomb. And then that's how people got confused and thought maybe Jesus had risen because body was missing. What's the problem with this theory? If Joseph, who was a member of the Sanhedrin, had moved the body, how is it that nobody, and then this big rumor gets started. How is it Joseph doesn't say, hey, wait a minute, guys. Y'all are jumping the gun here. Would you move the body? I think there's an even bigger problem than that. Why would Joseph, a zealous member of the Sanhedrin, a Pharisee whose whole life is devoted to keeping the law, why would he break the Sabbath to do secretly and illegally something he could have done with nobody questioning it 24 hours later? I'm sorry?
So nobody would believe God.
Why would he want people not to believe God? So Joseph, in order for this to be true, Joseph, who's Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, would have had to violate the Sabbath in order to do secretly something he could have done 24 hours later with nobody questioning it. Why would he do that? That doesn't make any sense. I mean, you're asking people to make a bigger leap of faith in some of these than in actually believing in the miracle. It took place. That's not a very popular theory because anybody who knows anything about Jewish culture and Jews in the first century just would find it laughable for Joseph to do that. The Romans moved the body. Now, this is not a very popular theory either. The Romans are only here because we're trying to cover all the bases, anybody who was there who could have done it. But why would the Romans want to encourage a Jewish messianic movement to get started? That's the last thing the Romans would have wanted to do. The Romans, in fact, authorized the sealing of the tomb. So, last thing the Romans would have wanted to do is that. No, hardly anybody believes that, but these have all been proposed by somebody. The Jewish authorities removed the body to prevent the veneration of the tomb. You know, they didn't want this messianic cult around Jesus to have anything to hang its hat on at all. So they got rid of the body to prevent veneration, turning the tomb into a shrine. What's the big problem with this theory? If the Jews moved the body, the Jews would have the body. If the Jews have the body, there's no Christian church. It never gets off the ground. I mean, they had all kinds of motive to stomp this thing out. They tried as hard as they could to stomp it out. If they had the body and said, well, let's just pretend we don't, I mean, that is totally insane. No way that could be possible. One of the more popular theories is that Jesus only lost consciousness. He was only mostly dead, you see, which is very different from actually dead. And Miracle Max, well, no, he's not actually part of the theory, but Jesus was bad off enough that they thought he was dead. He was mostly dead. But then in the tomb, he revived in the cool of the tomb and let himself out somehow and convinced people that he had died and was still alive. The only way you can believe this is if you are completely ignorant about two things. Completely ignorant about the physiology of crucifixion and the archaeology of tomb construction. Okay? So let's talk about crucifixion. Got a cross, which is here. They're going to lay me down on it sideways like this. And they're going to drive a spike through both of my ankles into the bottom of the cross. They're then going to twist me around. And you've seen some pictures that actually show it kind of like this. You're going to twist me around this way and nail my hands, or probably the wrists, because the nails would have pulled out of the palms a little bit too easily. And then they're going to pick this thing up and drop it in the socket. And I'm not even going to maintain that position any longer than I already have, because it's very uncomfortable, even without nails. And even when you're cheating, like I was. Once you're up there, your weight is pulling against those nails. And the way your body is twisted constricts your diaphragm so that it's very hard to breathe. People who are crucified usually died from asphyxiation, actually. That got them before blood loss, which would have done it eventually. But they usually died from asphyxiation. So what you do is you want to go ahead and lose consciousness and die because it's excruciating. I mean, it's the most cruel form of execution ever dreamed up by the perverse mind of man. People would sometimes hang on the cross for days going through this. But what happens is your stupid autonomous nervous system, which doesn't know that you don't want to survive any longer, tells your body, hey, body, you need to breathe. And in order to get a breath, you have to push against that nail through your ankles to alleviate the strain on your torso so that you can get a breath. But then you just transfer all the pain to your hands and your shoulders, and that's so excruciating you sag back down again until the next time you involuntarily jerk upward to get another breath, because your stupid autonomous nervous system keeps doing this to you. And hours and sometimes days people would be in that situation. All right. When the sundown was getting close, because the Jewish Sabbath starts from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, okay? They said, we got to get those bodies off the cross. We don't want them up there during the Sabbath. And so Pilate says to the soldiers, go break their legs. Because see, once they break the legs, you can't push up to get a breath anymore. You will very quickly then asphyxiate, die from lack of oxygen. When they got to Jesus, he was already dead. So he's certified as dead by professional executioners who, just to make sure, stuck him in the side with the spear, and it says water and blood came out, which is probably a description of the fact that the blood had already separated into its constituent elements, which is a clinical sign of death. But even if somehow Jesus had survived all of that, we now stick him in the tomb. The tomb is a cave carved into a solid wall of rock. And in front of this cave, there is a stone, a big cylindrical stone. Now, you probably have to stoop to go in, but big enough for a person to walk through that entry. That's a pretty heavy rock. It's in a kind of a trough that's slanted so that if the tomb is open, the rock is uphill. One person can close it. You just pull out the chop. The rock rolls into place. There's a stop to catch it. The tomb is closed. It takes one man to close the tomb, but it takes 4 strong men to roll that stone uphill. 4 men who can get grips on it. Now, Jesus is supposed to stand up on those ankles and take those wrists and hands, pushing against that rock from the inside of the tomb where he can't get a grip, and he's supposed to let himself out. I guarantee you if he'd done it, he would have freaked out the guards. But the swoon theory, this is called the swoon theory, has no credibility to anybody who actually knows anything about the physiology of crucifixion and the archaeology of tomb construction. As Miracle Max says, it would take a miracle. turns out we rejected the first theory because we didn't want a miracle. And it's not that easy to get away from it. Wow. The women mistook the grave and the uncertain light went to the wrong tomb, okay? The women have been up all night. They've lost a night's sleep. They've been crying the whole time. They still are. They're, and it's just the very first crack of dawn. There's not that much light. It would be easy, very easy for them to get confused, disoriented, go to the wrong tomb. It's empty. They freak out and start the rumor that Jesus rose from the dead. If the women went to the wrong tomb, Jesus would still be in the right tomb. All the Jews have to do is go get him. Christian movement is over. Those are two of the more popular ones. Probably the one that most atheists today would go for is that the grave was never visited at all, and the story is a later legend. Okay? 50, 60 years later, people remembered Jesus and were so impressed that the story had grown in the telling all this time, and eventually the legend of the resurrection took place. Hasn't been enough time. Okay, 30 years ago, for us is 1991. Could somebody come up with a cockamamie resurrection theory about somebody we knew in 1991 and get away with it? No. It wasn't a later legend. It was proclaimed immediately. That's one of the facts. It's a fact that they were proclaiming it immediately. So it can't be a later legend that was made up later. It might be wrong. They might have been lying with the later legend thing. Not possible. You don't get to just ignore one of the facts. The disciples stole the body. Disciples stole the body and made the story up. They don't look like people who could have pulled that off in the first place. In the second place, if they did, they would have all known that they were lying. 10 out of the 11 surviving apostles were martyred. Is it really believable that in the 11th, John was exiled for his faith? Is it really believable that they would sacrifice all that for something they knew to be a lie? It's not absolutely impossible, but again, it's very, very contrary to human nature. That's not the way human nature works. Charles Colson, by the way, this was the thing that convinced him. He had been reading Mere Christianity, and God had put him under conviction, but the thing that tipped him into faith was, he says, look, I was part of a group of guys that were some of the most intelligent and competent and committed people in the country to their cause. We were absolutely committed to maintaining this cover-up and telling this lie because of our loyalty to Richard Nixon. And we couldn't do it. In fact, we weren't even threatened with death. All they had to do was threaten us with a little jail time, and we started dropping like flies and telling the truth. And so he said, there's no way I can believe the disciples lied about this, because I tried to do that. I know how hard it is, and there's no way they could have done it. Every one of these theories has problems. The disciples hallucinated the resurrection appearances. They wanted to believe it so bad no, look, people don't have group hallucinations. Hallucination is an individual thing. One of the disciples might have hallucinated it, but 500 people don't have the same hallucination. That is contrary to the nature of hallucinations. In other words, it's contrary to nature, contrary to science, That sounds like a miracle to me. The only reason we're down this far on the page is because we wouldn't accept the miracle at the top, and now we're asking people to accept that. Space aliens, oh, never mind. Beamed up the bottom. Yeah, you're right. Here's the bottom line. Every theory has problems. I'm going to argue every theory but one has fatal problems. Now, your skeptic thinks that accepting a miracle is a fatal problem. Okay? But he's in a tough position because, if he wants to be honest, because a lot of the more credible of the incredible theories pretty much involve ignoring laws of science too. I mean, it's not that easy to avoid a miracle in this situation. And how can you know that miracles are impossible unless you know that God doesn't exist? If you admit even the theoretical possibility that God exists, then why is a miracle ruled out before we even look at the evidence? Every theory but one has fatal problems. The only problem with the resurrection is you got to believe a miracle happened. But can we really do that? Now, even we do not easily accept accounts of miracles. Have y'all got a funeral home here in Ellaville? So if I came in here this morning and I say, you guys hear what happened in the funeral home last night? This guy had been like dead for 3 days. They were having his funeral. All of a sudden he gets up, sits up in his coffin, gets out of it, and walks away. Now, how many of you believe this story? I'm not seeing a lot of hands. Because you think very rationally that it's more probable that I either am deceived myself or I'm deceiving you. Yeah, Williams made this story up as an illustration. You think that's pretty likely and that it actually happened is very unlikely. And you're people who believe that Jesus rose from the dead and that miracles are possible. But you still don't accept a miracle unless you have really good evidence, because miracles are rare. That's what makes them miracles. If they happened every day, we just ignore them. So, problem with the resurrection miracle, why should we believe that miracle happened? Well, problems with the others are they either contradict the facts or fail to explain the facts. And the only one that actually explains the 4 or 5 facts, you got to accept a miracle. Yeah, that's hard to do, but why should we do it this time? Every theory about what happened to the body but one has fatal flaws. The only flaw with the only theory that actually explains it is you have to believe a miracle happened. That's the garden tomb, by the way, which is probably not the actual tomb, but it's still worth seeing if you get to go to Israel, because it will show you what the actual tomb was like. What about this miracle? This is not some random person in some miscellaneous place that we're saying was raised from the dead. That's why that's one of the reasons you didn't believe my story about the funeral home. Because, I mean, millions of people die and stay dead, and that's normal. And why should this one be different? Well, if you're thinking about Jesus as just some random dude, then there's pretty much no reason to think God would have raised him from the dead out of the blue. But it doesn't come out of the blue. This is a person whose coming was prepared for by providence and predicted by prophecy for 2,000 years. This is a person whose friends were constantly saying, what manner of man is this? Because thinking of him as a mere human being just didn't work. This is a man who has already shown himself to be sovereign over life and death, raising Lazarus, the widow's son of Nain, etc. If ever there was a man of whom we could believe such a thing, it is this man. It is Jesus of Nazareth. In other words, it's not just could God have done a miracle, is would God have done this miracle? And God has actually spent the whole Old Testament preparing us for it. Isaiah 53, Psalm 22. And it's the capstone to the life of not just any old person, but of Jesus. It's not just, could God have done this? Which the answer is yes. That's probably not enough. The answer is, first you've got to get a yes to, there could be a God who could have done it. But it's not just could God have done it, it's could God have done a miracle, it's would God have done this miracle. Not some random dude, but Jesus as the summation of his life, as the exclamation mark to that sentence. So, have I proved that Jesus rose from the dead? No, history can't give you that. What I've done is I have, I think, absolutely eliminated from consideration the atheist who says, well, you Christians just believe a bunch of myths and fairy tales. We pay attention to the evidence. That's gone. That no longer has any credibility whatsoever. If you believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, you're believing something that history gives the strongest testimony to it that it is capable of giving. You're believing something that is consistent with the facts. You're believing something that is not only consistent with the facts, but provides an explanation of them that makes all of history, centering on that event, come together in a form that makes sense. And therefore, you are absolutely justified in believing it. And even though you don't have an absolute logical proof, the atheist, the skeptic, is the one who has a lot of splaining to do, not you. And if we can encourage them to see themselves in that position, perhaps they will be able to open their minds to the strength of the evidence. So, there's my historical case for the resurrection of Christ. Any questions? Comments? Rabbit trails.
You want me to jump in as a historian?
You want to add anything as the professional historian in the room?
Yeah, I will add a couple of things I was thinking about. One is Dr. Don made a big deal over this idea that there is, you don't have a rock solid proof beyond proof case from history. Well, history really doesn't give you that. Every single person that you believe exists in history, I mean, how many of you believe that Caesar was real? Any of them? Do you believe Napoleon was real? Do you believe Patton was real? We have the same kind of evidence for Jesus that we have for Caesar. You've heard of Homer, the Greek poet. We have more evidence for Jesus than we do for Homer in absolute terms. So as historians who are talking about this and looking at this, it's really interesting. You'll see people, they have no problem believing that Homer existed and that Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, but suddenly when you get to Jesus, even though there's much more evidence, oh, no, we don't like that. And what they're doing is they're switching the standard of evidence on you. They've got one standard of evidence for every other historical personage. And I'm not even talking about Jesus' claims being right. I'm talking about him existing. They've got one standard of historical evidence for those people, And then they've got this other one over here for Jesus, which is so high that history literally cannot reach it. And it's not that Jesus doesn't exist, it's that it is not actually possible for history to prove something to that level. Yeah, it's like, trying to, get science to resurrect the dead truly and completely. It just is not physical. It's just not possible. And so
you're saying that skeptical historians are cheap.
absolutely. And that's something that you're going to find a lot, especially the internet atheists do. They are not interested in finding the truth. They are interested, like Dr. Don said, in proving their point. And whatever they have to do to get that point across, that's what they'll shift and that's what they'll do, including using logical fallacies as proofs. They do that all the time. That's another completely different topic. One other thing to think about is, Dr. Don talked quite a bit about biblical evidence. When we think about the Bible, a lot of us, I think, tend to forget that the Bible isn't the singular Bible. The Bible is a collection of books written over thousands of years that came from all kinds of different authors in all kinds of different places. So when you talk about the Bible as your source, you're not talking about a single one source. You're talking about 66 different sources that are written across time by different people in different circumstances, and they're all pointing to this one truth. So the Bible is actually multiple sources in one. And let me see. Oh yeah, well, one last thought that I think is worth mentioning is that people also say, well, what about sources that are outside the Bible? Well, first you can say, well, the Bible is outside the Bible as far as that goes. And what I mean by that is it wasn't written by one person with one perspective trying to prove one point. It was written, like I said, by all these different people from different places and different times, all attesting to this one truth. And that's why the church went and chose it, because it was and assembled it into one volume, because that's where their proof comes from. This is their case to you. They're showing you. But there are also other references to Jesus outside the Bible. Josephus, for example, the Jewish historian, makes a mention of Jesus. And if I'm remembering correctly, because I'm a Civil War historian, but if I remember correctly, he talked about the Jews being upset because of Christus, Christ, and there being rioting and whatnot going on. So showing that there was a large to-do because of Christ. And this is somebody who is not a Christian, is not a part of the Bible, talking about, again, the existence of Christ and something going on that is connected, in this case, I'd say, to the resurrection because of what was going on. But anyway, those are my thoughts. Any other questions, comments for Dr. Don?
What would y'all say is the most popular theory critics like to use?
Haven't actually totaled it up, but my impression is that the legend theory is the one that's most in ascendance now. The swoon theory, the women went to the wrong tomb, those have been popular explanations in the past. But among actual scholars, I think the tendency is to go the legend route.
And you can correct me on this, but the vibe that I've gotten is that the internet atheists, the ones that you're most likely to run into, they'll go all the way back and say, well, Jesus couldn't have been crucified because he wasn't real.
Yeah, never existed.
Yeah, that Jesus never existed, and therefore that's why he could obviously never have been crucified. He could never have risen from the dead, which from a historical standpoint is just absolute ignorance. I mean, it's the kind of thing that people can use big words to express, but they are essentially telling you something moronic. And I'm being frank there.
As I said, no actual historian buys into that.
And that gets back again to this standard of evidence thing. Historians, especially historians of the ancient world, don't have many sources to work with. You can correct me on this because it's been a while since I saw the number. Do you know how many copies we have of Homer's works? from even relatively close to his time. Something like 5 to 8. And
Just
they
a
were-
handful, yeah.
And they were written over 500 years after he was dead. And based on that, we accept the existence of Homer and the existence of Homer's Greece. But we can't accept the existence of Christ, who has all of this massive evidence, the testimony of the New Testament, over 25,000 manuscripts from within 200 years, I believe it is, of when he lived, 5,000 in the original Greek.
Yeah.
And I mean, the evidence from a historical standpoint in terms of ancient history is absolutely overwhelming. You can disagree on whether you believe Jesus was the Son of God. You can disagree on whether you believe he rose from the dead, but it is absolutely ridiculous to suggest that he was not a real person.
That's pretty much true. That's it.
Continuing on the point that you were making, advise us further on how to reason and persuade with someone to be open to believing a miracle.
I think Brian pointed out earlier, or maybe that was a conversation, I don't remember, that atheism is claiming you can prove a negative. Okay, so logically, you have to be at least theoretically open to the possibility that God exists. There are lots and lots and lots of reasons for believing that the existence of God is the best explanatory theory we have for the existence of the universe, its form, and particularly the presence of personal, rational human beings in it. Brian was going into that a bit yesterday as well. And there's the, that was a version of the cosmological argument that Brian gave us focused on reason. There's just lots and lots of reasons why the existence of God explains why we have people, and the non-existence of God leaves man himself as a completely insoluble mystery. Because how did reason evolve from irrational nature? Water can't rise above its source, and that's the whole theory. That whole theory is a theory based on the idea that it has somehow. So yeah, I mean, the existence of God just makes sense, and it's the hard thing to do is just to get people to even be open to it. You know, it's I don't know how many people I've seen saying, well, there's no evidence for the existence of God. A person who says that tells you he doesn't want to have the conversation. Because the level of ignorance there is just so mind-boggling, you can't even, you can say, I don't think the evidence is persuasive. You can say, I think there's counter-evidence. You can say, I don't think there's enough evidence. But to say there's no evidence is to simply admit that you are totally ignorant of the entire history of this discussion from the beginning of time down to today. It's like you never heard of Thomas Aquinas. You never heard of anybody who's thought about this, but it's the attitude of I don't want God to exist, therefore I'm going to deny that he does, and while I'm doing it, I'm going to try to present myself as the superior intellect, who just pays attention to the evidence and doesn't believe in myths and fairy tales like you Christians do. I think that we have sufficiently shown that the shoe's on the other foot as far as that goes. Yeah, go ahead.
I think something else that's important to think about here is when you're talking about miracles and you're talking about establishing, is this possible? You don't have to go all the way to Christ or specifically to Christianity. That actually gets into kind of another one of those circular arguments. Why do you believe in the Bible? Because God wrote it. Why do you believe in God? Because he's in the Bible. Well, why do you believe in Christ? Because he's God. Why do you believe in God? Because he's Christ, is kind of the idea. And what you're talking about here, improving the resurrection of Christ, you want to get people to think about the possibility, is there a God at all? Because if there is a God at all, it doesn't matter who he is. We could even say she for that at this point. It doesn't matter who it is. If there is a supernatural God, then that means miracles are theoretically possible. That there's something outside of this universe that could affect it in ways that we don't understand. And if miracles are possible, then you have to start looking at the evidence of individual miracles and saying, did this miracle happen? And if you have to look at it and you have to honestly say, the best response here is that this is a real miracle and it actually happened, then that transforms the whole question, because now you know something about who this God is. And that's the step that C.S. Lewis took. He didn't go straight to being Christian. He went from an atheist first to believing there was a God. And once you do that, if God exists, it blows the door wide open to all kinds of things people don't want to think about.
People think of a miracle as a random event. But of course, we don't believe miracles are random events. We believe they are carefully planned and designed events that God has inserted into nature. So, if you're a scientist and you don't believe in miracles, you can't do experiments. Because if you just let nature run your lab, you can never pour anything into the test tube. Nature didn't do that. You did. You can't stick anything on the Bunsen burner. Nature doesn't light the Bunsen burner. You have to do that. Nature doesn't put the flask on it. You have inserted something into the time stream of nature that was flowing along that caused a different event to occur than would have occurred otherwise. It's exactly what God does when he does a miracle. It's not a random thing. It's God creating a different outcome than we were expecting by doing something intentional and rational and purposeful. And if persons can't do that to nature, then science is out of business. And we'll have to go back to living in caves. Because you cause something different to happen than what nature would have done without your interference every time you do an experiment in a lab.
Or forget that, every time Joe builds a house.
Yeah.
I mean, it's true. Houses
Nature's going to leave that wood in the tree or rotting on the ground. Nature's not going to saw it into boards and nail it up in a rational design. Yeah.
And what happens over time if you don't maintain that house?
Nature takes it back.
Nature takes it back and it falls back apart into its natural state. So what we see is humans, and we as Christians know it's humans made in the image of God, are able to actually influence nature and make nature do things that nature does not normally do. And that's what a miracle does. It's just God doing it instead of us.
And how did it come about that we can do that? Because somebody else did it first.
And why are we the only ones who can do it? Yes, they found pictures of monkeys poking anthills with sticks. I think they found some who were beating things with a rock. They said, "Oh, that shows tools." But no, you compare a monkey poking an anthill with a stick to anything that happens at ProMod. Well, I don't know. Joe might think that there's something similar there. But, they are orders of magnitude beyond anything that you can compare. And you have to look at that and say, why? Why are human beings the only ones who can do that? If naturalistic evolution were true, if everything were just the accidental result of evolution, why don't we see a whole range of different creatures out there with different stages of tools and creativity and interventions? But we don't see that. We see monkeys poking things with sticks, and we see people building cathedrals.
We are not one step further down the evolutionary path beyond the bonobo. We are a right turn and a quantum leap across the Grand Canyon. The Evel Knievel theory of evolution. I mean, evolution couldn't do that. Evolution, the processes of evolution work up to a point. They can't. You're going to have Evel Knievel lying in the Colorado River. You're not going to get man on the other side of the Grand Canyon by those processes alone.
All right.
All right.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. We're going to take about a 10, 15-minute break. There are some snacks in the fellowship hall, some coffee, soft drinks, water. If you want to slip over there and get something, go to the restroom. 10, 15 minutes at the most, and then we'll meet right back in here and finish our last session, okay?
I just want to go home and I want to take a roll and go take a nap.
Forever he sought me and bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me and I knew him and gone.
He's probably like, well,
Monkey's pushing the button.
yes.
Monkey's pushing.
Exactly. That's what I'm